This is Joyce Tice. I'm talking to Bob Strohecker, who's going to tell us about the Shade Tree Commission. It's December 2016. Tell us, first of all, what is the Shade Tree Commission?
Well, the Shade Tree Commission is a group within our borough that is directed by ordinance of the borough to maintain the trees and the plantings within the shade tree right-of-way. Typically the right-of-way for the Shade Tree Committee that we can plant within is the area between the curb and the sidewalk, so the green space between curb and sidewalk. Now, we're going to rewrite our ordinances because there's some places where our sidewalks are directly adjacent to the curb. For example, on South Main Street, where there's many large trees, right now, as defined by the Shade Tree Ordinance, we wouldn't really have jurisdiction over those trees, but I think we need to be, because we need to have some jurisdiction on, better defining the planting area, only because there's areas such as that we don't want all those trees to come down and not have any new ones replanted. In particular, the borough gets the authority for the Shade Tree Commission by state. It's in the state borough code. So it's a commission that is allowed by boroughs within the state code. Now the boroughs can elect to have or not have a Shade Tree Commission. I don't know the exact year in which Mansfield was, the Shade Tree Commission was added to the borough, but I know it's at least 20 to 25 years that they had done some planting. Now, I've been on the borough council for about 9 years now, and I've actively been managing the Shade Tree Committee for about 8 years. And prior to me being on or taking over the chairmanship of the Shade Tree Committee, there was not a lot of activity over the last, say, 10 to 15 years. So really the bulk of the activity's been in the last 8 years, where we've been actively removing older trees, or trees that are diseased, or trees that are inappropriately planted in the past, and then systematically replanting with trees that are of different species, more desirable species at times. If they're under power lines, we typically plant trees that only get 20 or 30 feet tall. If they're more open space, then obviously we'll put larger trees in. Depends upon the space between the sidewalk and curb. At times, we can put larger trees in if there's support for the roots of those trees and that type of thing.
What are some of the species that you're using on the streets now?
Well, I'll just go down like Main Street, in front of the Baptist Church, Forest Building. It's a Japanese flowering lilac called Syringia. Down in front of the west side of North Main, we have locust trees. On the opposite side of the street, on the east side of North Main, there's a small ornamental maple that gets a nice red flower on it. I don't know, I think it's called ruby slippers of a maple. If we jump across the street in front of First Citizens, along the south side of Route 6, there's lilac trees, pear trees, flowering pears that were put in there about 3 years ago. Just this fall, on the east side of South Main Street, in front of First Citizens, the first 6 trees, we replanted those this year, and those are a hawthorn.
Okay.
So they will have a thorn on them, but they get a nice little small ornamental berry in the fall that can be, the birds will eat. On the opposite side of the street, in front of my office, on the west side of South Main Street, we have ginkgo,
I knew that. I love those.
Yeah, I love they have the really unique leaves to the ginkgo. It's a Chinese origin. And then when we go south of there, we jump into some more locusts, and we've done a lot on Main Street so far.
Now you have one major project that you've been talking about for a couple of years, and that is replanting Smythe Park. Smythe Park used to be very, very densely treed, and it's been reduced. So you've been working on that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, we had just, prior to starting this recording, we had looked at the 1950 photos of Smythe Park, and even if you look at 1970 photos prior to the 72 flood, I mean, along the dike was much lower, but it was heavily forested in even the 70s. And you go back to the 50s, all that area where like the soccer fields are, or the baseball fields, it was densely populated with trees. I'm talking hundreds of trees. We just did a grant write in 2014. We were successful in that grant through the state Department of Community and Natural Resources, Conservation and Natural Resources, for about almost $7,000. We were able to purchase, I think, 69 trees of 17 different species.
Oh, nice.
Were planted back into the park, and that number of 69 more than doubled the canopy that had been there. So you're talking of hundreds of trees, now down to only probably under 70 for the whole park. And so it was really a good thing. Not only did we go through several months prior to the planting, we had about a group of 20 of us go down, and we did removal, we did trimming, some of the dead trees around the pavilion that was just all cluttered with shrubs that had been let go and you couldn't see in the pavilion. It was just, they would catch garbage. We cleaned those all out. The big arborvitaes that were behind the stone that talk about the first, that commemorates the first night football game. I mean, there was a homeless person that had a sleeping bag and supplies and everything behind that. It was just a mess, and it was just all overgrown. We cut that down and put ornamental shrubbery behind that stone, and just did a really nice thing. They're all going to be large trees that were appropriate for the park, and will really make that. I mean, it looks different already, but you give that another 5 years, and it's going to be really wonderful. And I'm down there, multiple times through the year, watering as needed, pruning. There was some deer damage where there were buck rubbing in the last fall, but just keeping track of the trees and pruning them as necessary, and just making sure that they're in healthy repair.
Well, you mentioned you have 17 species, and we've had so many instances over the last 50 years where a particular species becomes diseased. So the diversity is important.
Correct. Well, in fact, on North Main, we've actually planted some elms that are resistant to the Dutch elm disease, which has taken out most of the elms in our area. I'm always looking at different varieties and different species, and trying to look at color at different times, and I usually have done also what we've done much more systematically is planting within blocks. We'll plant the same species within a block and then switch it, because I think that creates variety, and it makes it more appealing when you're going from block to block, that it does look like there's some order to what you're doing, and that type of thing. This fall we spent several $1,000s in just trimming, and we do that at least every other year. We have the arborists come in. I go through town with them, and we point out the trees that need to be pruned or they're diseased and need to have some really excessive pruning maybe done on them, and removing the dead woody material. So it's an active committee that in the fall and spring we typically have a fall planting after the trees go dormant. They're harvested in the nursery, and the nursery we use is called Schichtel's out of just south of Buffalo, New York. And we plant what are called bare root trees. The trees are harvested. They go underneath the root of the tree with like a forked lift, and they pop them out of the ground. They're dipped in gel and bagged, and again, this is done once the trees are dormant. They're to us within 2 weeks of being harvested, and we get them in the ground within days of coming to the burrow. They're delivered by the nursery, and there's a cycle and multiple burrows within the northern tier of Pennsylvania, all the way down to like Williamsport, all the way over to Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, Stevens State College. Kind of that area is serviced on the day we get our delivery, and so there'll be usually a early November planting, and then there'll be an early May planting. So we're always planning for that and preparing and thinking about the next locations we may involve to do replanting. As far as a committee, we're given $5,000 a year through allocation from the borough annual budget to manage and use that for the maintenance of the trees in our borough.
Well, I know I've seen you out there, you and other members of the committee, doing a lot of the planting and maintenance yourself.
Right. Yeah. We try to get some of the high school kids to come along, and this fall, New Covenant kids came along with us and helped us, and Steve Hoover from DCNR, the Forestry Department over in Wellsboro, he comes over and sometimes brings some men with him, and it's kind of a fun day. It usually takes about a half a day. This fall we put in 13 trees. 7 of them actually were replacements due to vandalism, so that was unfortunate.
Oh, that's
but
awful.
that's just part of the process, and we were really fortunate that we have this way of replacing them, and a group that oversees the trees and make sure this really, it beautifies our community, and I think it's really important. It adds to community.
It does. I mean, any small town that's got its trees is a lot more aesthetically pleasing. And you mentioned doing it by block, and it's so effective, particularly with a flowering tree, to have that conformity when it blooms.
Yep.
Or with the shade trees too.
Oh yeah. One of our recent projects that'll be coming up probably in the fall, I just wrote a grant for the redo of the Graydon Scott Playground, and that is not only going to get, we had just gotten a grant for I think $150,000 that will help us redo the playground. Part of that, I wrote an additional grant for about 8 trees, I believe, to redo the planting along the roadway and some other larger shade trees within the park itself. So I haven't heard back from that. I should hear back in the next week or two related to the success of our application, but relatively small. It's less than $1,000, but still, again, it's useful if we can aid the borough in this way and bring in some dollars when we don't have to spend them.
Sure. Well, thank you, Bob, for telling us about this project in Mansfield, and thank you for making Mansfield beautiful and keeping it beautiful.
Well, thanks. I'm glad that we can volunteer our time and still be physically able to do these kinds of things. So, thank you.
Okay.